Hello and welcome to the Sleepy Historian. Find a comfortable place. Let the sounds of the world outside fade away, and allow your mind to drift back in time with me. Tonight, we're not visiting a grand battle or a royal coronation. Instead, we're seeking something quieter, something far more elusive in the medieval world than gold or glory. We're searching for privacy. Did you know that for a knight living in a castle, the very concept of a private room, a space to call their own, was almost entirely alien? It's a fascinating thought, isn't it? So, as you settle in, take a slow, deep breath. And let's wander the cold stone corridors of the past together to understand what life was truly like behind castle walls. If you enjoy these quiet journeys into history, perhaps consider subscribing. It helps our small corner of the past continue to grow. Now, let the story begin. Imagine your home. You likely have a room, a space that is yours. A door you can close, walls that muffle sound, a window that frames your own private view of the world. It is a sanctuary, a place for quiet contemplation, for unguarded moments, for simply being yourself. This idea is so deeply ingrained in our modern lives that we scarcely think about it. It is a fundamental expectation. But for the medieval knight, this concept would have been as strange and foreign as a horseless carriage or a talking mirror. Their world was not built on the foundation of the individual, but of the collective. Their lives were lived out loud, on a public stage. From the moment they woke to the moment they fell into an often interrupted sleep. The castle was not a collection of private homes under one roof. It was a single, sprawling, interconnected household, and the knight was but one small, very visible part of it. To find our knight, we must first go to the heart of this world. The Great Hall. This was the engine room of the castle, a vast, cavernous space with a soaring, timbered ceiling often lost in shadow and smoke. By day, it was a whirlwind of activity. The air would be thick with the smell of roasting meat from the kitchens, the scent of wood smoke from the central hearth, the aroma of spilled ale, and the undeniable, earthy smell of dozens, if not hundreds, of people living in close quarters, along with their dogs who roamed freely, hoping for scraps. The noise would have been a constant, rolling symphony of life. The clang of armor being mended in a corner, the chatter of servants, the boisterous laughter of men-at-arms, the serious tones of the lord conducting business from his raised dais, the music of a travelling minstrel. It was a place of perpetual motion and sound. There was no door to close on this. This was the knight's living room, his dining room, his office, and his social club, all rolled into one. Here, our knight would take his meals. He wouldn't sit at a private table, but on a long, rough-hewn bench at a trestle table, shoulder to shoulder with his comrades. The hierarchy was strict, of course. His proximity to the lord's high table was a clear indicator of his status. But physical proximity to others was unavoidable. Conversations were rarely private. A whispered comment could be easily overheard. A shared glance could be intercepted. Every social interaction, every meal, every drink was a performance, a reinforcement of one's place in the rigid social structure of the household. There were no intimate family dinners, no quiet meals for two. There was only the great, communal act of eating, surrounded by the entire castle community. When the day's duties were done, the training in the bailey, the patrols on the walls, the attendance upon the lord, the great hall would transform. The trestle tables would be cleared away, and the space would become a venue for entertainment. Perhaps there would be storytelling, or songs, or games of chance played on a chalked board. The knight would be expected to participate, to be part of this social fabric. To retreat, to seek solitude, would be seen as bizarre, even suspicious. It would imply that you had something to hide, or that you were melancholic, or worse, that you were arrogant, believing yourself to be above the company of your fellows. Community was survival. To be separate was to be vulnerable. This constant, enforced sociability was not a burden to them. It was the very essence of their existence. And when the last song was sung, and the fire in the great hearth burned down to glowing embers, the great hall underwent its final transformation of the day. It became a dormitory. For many knights, especially in earlier medieval castles or for those of lower rank, this was their bedroom. There were no private chambers waiting for them. Instead, servants would lay out pallets on the floor. Simple bags of straw or rushes, perhaps with a woolen blanket and a block of wood or a rolled-up cloak for a pillow. The knights would unbuckle their armor, loosen their tunics, and lie down to sleep amidst the lingering smells and sounds of the day. They slept in the same space where they had eaten and talked, surrounded by the snores, coughs, and restless turnings of dozens of their companions. The dogs would curl up by the hearth, and the guards on duty would tread softly on the stone floors, their footsteps echoing in the vast, dark space. Imagine the vulnerability of it. There was no privacy in sleep. A nightmare, a muttered word, a moment of weakness, all were potentially public. The concept of personal space was a luxury that did not exist. Knights of a slightly higher standing, or in later, more developed castles, might have fared a little better. They might have been assigned to a shared chamber, a room known as a dormitory, with several other knights. Here they might have had a simple wooden bed, perhaps shared with another man. The idea of sharing a bed was not intimate in the way we perceive it today. It was a practical matter of warmth and space. These rooms were sparsely furnished, functional, and still very much communal. A dozen men might sleep in one chamber, their belongings stored in a single wooden chest at the foot of their bed. This chest was perhaps the only truly personal space a knight possessed. A locked container for his few precious items, his letters, a token from a loved one. It was a tiny island of privacy in an ocean of communal living. This lack of personal space extended to all aspects of life. A knight would not have a private wardrobe. His clothes, his armor, his weapons. They were part of the household's inventory, maintained and stored in common armories and storerooms. He was part of a unit, and his very identity was tied to his role within that unit, not to his individual selfhood. The idea of retreating to one's room to read a book, to write a letter, or to simply be alone with one's thoughts was an unimaginable luxury. The very architecture of the early castle was designed to foster this communal life, with its large, open-plan halls and limited number of smaller rooms. So, if the knight had no privacy, did anyone? To answer that, we must leave the noisy, public spaces of the hall and ascend the winding stone staircase to the lord's own quarters. Here, things begin to change, but perhaps not as much as you might think. The primary private space for the lord and his family was the solar. This room, often located above the great hall, was a significant step up in comfort and seclusion. The name itself, solar, is derived from the sun, as these rooms were often positioned to catch the best light, with larger windows, perhaps even with expensive glass panes instead of just wooden shutters. It was warmer, quieter, and more comfortably furnished. There would be tapestries on the walls to block the drafts, rushes mixed with sweet-smelling herbs on the floor, and finer furniture. A comfortable chair for the lord, a space for the lady to do her needlework. This was the lord's private living room and office. Here he could retreat from the chaos of the great hall to conduct sensitive business, to meet with important advisors, or to spend time with his immediate family. But we must be careful with our modern definition of private. The solar was not a sanctuary of solitude. The lord and lady would almost always be accompanied by their personal attendants, servants, a clerk, or a chaplain. The door was rarely closed, and people would come and go as business required. It was a space of relative privacy, a place where the general rabble of the castle was excluded, but it was by no means a space for being truly alone. It was a stage, just a smaller and more exclusive one than the great hall below. Adjacent to the solar, one would typically find the lord's bedchamber. This was the most private room in the entire castle, the inner sanctum. Yet even here, the concept of privacy was fluid. The chamber was not just for sleeping. It was a reception room for honored guests, a place where the Lord might finalize a treaty or dictate a letter. And at night, it was rarely empty. Trusted servants, often young squires or pages, would sleep on pallets at the foot of the Lord's bed. They were there for security, and to be on hand to fetch a drink of water, tend to the fire, or assist their master should he need anything in the night. The idea of a married couple having the bedroom entirely to themselves was not the norm. Their most intimate moments were lived with the knowledge that others were sleeping just a few feet away, separated only by the darkness and social convention. Within this already semi-public bedchamber, however, lay the single most important piece of private technology in the medieval castle, the great bed itself. We often see them in illustrations. Enormous four-poster structures, intricately carved, and most importantly, hung with heavy, thick curtains. This was not merely for decoration. The bed was, in essence, a room within a room. When those curtains were drawn, they created a small, enclosed, and deeply private space. They blocked out the drafts that whistled through the stone walls, creating a warm microclimate. They muffled sound, both from within and without. And crucially, they provided complete visual privacy. Behind the curtains, the lord and lady could be truly alone, shielded from the eyes of the servants sleeping in the same room. The bed was the ultimate status symbol, not just for its cost, but for the privacy it afforded. For a night sleeping on the floor of the great hall, such a cocoon of warmth, silence, and solitude would have been the very definition of unimaginable luxury. Nowhere is the medieval attitude towards privacy more starkly illustrated than in the matter of sanitation. We, in our world of private, sterile bathrooms, might find the medieval approach rather shocking. The castle toilet was called the guardrobe, which charmingly translates to warding the robes, as people would hang their clothes inside the toilet shaft, believing the ammonia from the waste would kill fleas and other pests. These were typically small stone rooms or closets built into the thickness of the outer castle walls. The toilet itself was a simple stone or wooden bench with a hole which opened directly onto a chute. The waste would then fall down the side of the castle wall into the moat below or a purpose-built cesspit. Functionally, it was a clever design, but was it private? Often not in the slightest. Some guardrobes were built in pairs or even in rows of 3, with no partitions between them. This meant that answering the call of nature could be a communal activity, a time for a chat with a fellow knight. Their location could also be surprisingly public. Some were situated at the end of short corridors, with no door, while others were little more than an alcove off a main chamber. The act was seen as a simple, biological necessity, devoid of the shame or intense need for privacy that we associate with it today. For the knight, using the guardrobe was just another part of a life lived in common, a life where the body and its functions were not things to be hidden away behind locked doors. It was a world without secrets, even in the most personal of moments. Given this overwhelming lack of personal space, one has to wonder, did a knight ever get a moment to himself? Was there anywhere he could go to escape the constant noise, the watchful eyes, the endless social obligations? The answer is yes, but these moments of solitude had to be actively sought, and they were found in the nooks and crannies of castle life, rather than in designated private spaces. One of the most important of these was the chapel. Every castle had a chapel or a small oratory, a space dedicated to God. While services were communal, a knight could seek out the chapel during quiet times of the day for private prayer and reflection. In the cool, silent presence of the stone altar and the filtered light from a stained glass window, he could find a measure of inner peace. This was a socially acceptable form of solitude. No one would question a man seeking a moment with his maker. It was a privacy of the soul, if not of the body. Another potential refuge was the castle grounds themselves. Within the safety of the curtain walls, there might be a small garden or an orchard. Here, amidst the herbs and flowers, a knight could walk and think, the sounds of the bailey softened by distance. He might also find a quiet moment on the battlements. During a change of the guard, or at a quiet time of day, he could stand alone, looking out over the surrounding countryside. The vastness of the landscape, the feeling of the wind, the sense of being a solitary watchman over the world below. This could provide a powerful, if temporary, feeling of separation and individual perspective. These were stolen moments. They weren't guaranteed, and they could be interrupted at any time. But they were precious nonetheless, small pockets of quiet in a world of constant noise. Confidentiality, a form of social privacy, also had to be manufactured. If a knight needed to have a sensitive conversation with another, they couldn't simply go into a private office and close the door. They had to create their own privacy. They might walk together in the bailey, their low voices masked by the clang of the blacksmith's hammer. Or they might find a secluded window embrasure, a deep-set window in the thick stone wall, where they could speak unheard. Privacy was not an architectural feature. It was a strategy, an action one had to take to carve out a small piece of the world for oneself for a brief period of time. It is also important to remember that this way of life was not static. The medieval period spanned 1,000 years, and over that time, attitudes and architecture slowly began to change. The early Norman motte and bailey castles of the 11th century were rudimentary fortresses, often consisting of little more than a single large wooden hall on a mound of earth. In such a structure, everyone, the lord, his family, his knights, and his servants, lived, ate, and slept together in one great room. Privacy was, for all practical purposes, non-existent, but as castle design evolved, so too did the potential for seclusion. By the later Middle Ages, in the 14th and 15th centuries, castles were becoming more comfortable, sophisticated residences, not just military strongholds. The influence of more luxurious manor house design began to show. Architects started to incorporate more rooms with more specific functions. Instead of a single great hall serving every purpose, new types of rooms appeared. Parlors, from the French word parler, meaning to speak, were created as rooms for more private conversation. The lord might have a private study or closet where he could read or manage his accounts. More bedchambers were added, allowing for greater separation of the household. Knights of high status might be granted their own small chamber, a truly revolutionary development. This was the dawn of privacy as we know it. This architectural evolution reflected a slow but profound cultural shift. The rise of literacy and the availability of books created a demand for quiet places to read. A growing emphasis on the individual, a seed of the Renaissance to come, meant that people began to value personal reflection and solitude more. The very idea of a home was beginning to shift from a communal, public fortress to a more private, domestic space. The castle began to be divided into more distinct zones: public areas, service areas, and private family quarters. Corridors were introduced, a simple but brilliant innovation. Instead of having to walk through one room to get to the next, corridors allowed for movement around the castle without disturbing the occupants of every chamber along the way. This simple architectural change had a massive impact on the potential for privacy. So, when we ask if a medieval knight expected privacy, the answer is a resounding no. He was born into a world where life was lived in the open, where community was paramount, and where solitude was suspicious. His days and nights were spent in the constant company of others. He ate, slept, worked, and relaxed on a public stage. His sense of self was inextricably linked to his position within the group. The fleeting moments of privacy he might have found in a chapel, on a wall walk, or in a quiet corner of the bailey were rare exceptions to a life of profound and unyielding togetherness. The castle was not his home. It was his barracks, his workplace, and his world, and he shared it with everyone. As we draw our story to a close, picture that night one last time. See him not as a lonely figure in a vast, empty castle, but as one face in a bustling crowd. His life was loud, smelly, and lived entirely in the public eye. The quiet, personal space we take for granted was a treasure he would never know. And perhaps, in understanding this, we can appreciate the silence of our own rooms a little more tonight. The simple, profound luxury of closing a door and being alone. I hope this story has given you a little peace and a little to dream about. Thank you for listening to The Sleepy Historian. Until next time, sleep well.